there we go. It seems like it was only last summer.
It was.
Oh, right. There we go. That's what I said. Anyway, we're going to reflect a little on that referendum campaign now. Time does give some perspective. And maybe look ahead at what will happen once the Brexit process has really begun, which is supposed to by the end of March. Two pivotal figures from the Leave and Remain campaign. They both paid large sums of money for me to say that. Paul Stevenson, he worked on the Victorious Vote Leave campaign. James McGrory, he worked on the not-so-victorious Britain Stronger in Europe campaign. Welcome to you both. Let me come to the victor first. What's the single biggest reason why you won? Looking back now.
I think the renegotiation and the failure of the renegotiation to deliver anything that was sellable on the doorsteps of the British people. The British people had been sceptical of the EU for a long time. Only about a third of the public actually really liked the EU and wanted to stay in regardless. And there was a whole bunch of people in the middle that both our campaigns were chasing after, the swing vote, and they needed to be convinced. And one way to convince them was to scare them about the consequences of a change. But the other way was to get a really good deal out of Europe. And there's lots of people like me who are in favour of European reform who might have been convinced by a better deal. And unfortunately, when you're forced into a binary choice, it was, well, actually, if this is what's on the table, let's go for leave.
What do you think was the single biggest reason that you lost?
I think there's a lot of merit in what Paul says, especially when, frankly, there was 30 years of almost unchallenged Euroscepticism in this country that had been allowed to take hold, and people on my side of the argument have to take a lot of responsibility for not challenging that in the decades running up to the referendum. And when you had such clear messages about money, border and laws, which the Leave campaign did, I think trying to counter them in really what was 6 months at the end of it, without anything new to show that European reform was, you know, a big deal that was going to be able to deliver changes that people wanted, made it very, very difficult indeed.
Were mistakes made? Because there are always mistakes made in all campaigns, including the victory campaigns. Looking back, were there mistakes that you made that if you hadn't made them, not you personally, the campaign, would have made a difference?
I don't think you can point to one single thing and say if we'd done this differently, we would have won. I think there were too many different factors involved. I do think that the fact that our campaign was reluctant to attack the Leave campaign in the same way that the Leave campaign were perfectly ready to attack our campaign really didn't help.
Was that a blue-on-blue problem?
It was a blue-on-blue problem.
Coming from Downing Street?
Coming from Downing Street, and I understand the reasons why they did that. They had political reasons why they wanted to keep their party together afterwards, but at times it was like bringing a spoon to a knife fight, and in politics that's never a good place to be.
To be fair, though, I mean, I think they were right, because it was when there were Downing Street authorised attacks on people like Boris Johnson and on Michael Gove, that suddenly these people realised that they were in a deathmatch. Actually, the Prime Minister and Chancellor's language was pretty severe throughout the campaign.
Well, it got ramped up as the campaign went on.
They said that people were economically illiterate, that half their MPs were threatening World War III. These people were quite upset. And so I take your point to an extent, but actually it was when they really started going for the senior figures, we got John Major out and Michael Heseltine out, to attack people on our campaign, that actually people like Boris and Michael thought, actually, we need to go on the attack as well. So I think it's more complicated.
Michael, what are your thoughts on these matters?
Well, I'm much more interested in the future. But
sure,
actually,
but it's nice it's a huge historic event in British
I agree with
politics.
Paul. David Cameron, in his Bloomberg speech, said he was setting out to achieve fundamental and far-reaching reform of the European Union. That was his phrase. And if he'd got it, like Paul, I would have been on his side in the referendum campaign. But the deal that he brought back was so inadequate that it was barely mentioned during the campaign. I mean, no one could say, look,
well, in my experience, it wasn't mentioned at all.
No one could say, look at this wonderful deal which is going to lead to reform. It was a dreadful deal.
And yet the same was true of Harold Wilson in 1975. He brought back a deal which was barely mentioned. He won.
He won, but it was a different time and it was a different European community, and I think there's a limit to which you can draw parallels.
I want to look forward now, but just before I do, who was the hero of your campaign? Who was the single most important person in your campaign? I'll ask you the same.
Can I have three?
No.
Oh, greedy.
I'd say Boris.
I think Will Straw deserves an enormous amount of credit for running an incredibly professional campaign where you got people from all parties together without falling out.
Boris Johnson and Will Straw. Let's look forward a little bit in the future. Is it not clear, although the government won't quite say it, the Prime Minister came pretty close to saying it on Sky News at the weekend, that we will not be members of the single market. The argument will be how much access will we have and on what terms, but it will not be membership. And therefore, the access cannot be great as membership. And the question is it 90% of what we have now, 85, 70%? That's at the crux of the negotiations, is it not?
I think so. I think people are accepting that we will leave the single market. And so now where the real debate is over is, do we stay in the customs union and get the benefits of doing free trade deals with countries around the world like America? And what length of a transition period will there be a transition period, and what length will that be?
Beyond the 2 years, you mean, beyond the 2 years of the negotiations?
Correct. So if we are leaving the customs union and we're leaving the single market, there is an argument for having a transition deal of perhaps 2 to 5 years, which allows you to move from one complicated system to another.
Do you accept that although there will be an argument over the degree of access we have to the single market, we will not be members of the single market in the way that we are now?
I think it's interesting that the government have not categorically ruled that out. They've been given ample opportunity to do so. So I think you have to then consider that it is still on the table because it is the best trading model that is available, in my opinion. But I do think the signs are there that that's the direction of travel the government is headed. And if that's the case, then we're still in a bit of a phony debate at the moment between in and out. And the points you make are the right ones. What is the degree of access? And if there's going to be less access, who are going to be the winners and losers here under any future free trade agreement? Because you can't have full access, in my opinion, without membership. Therefore, you're going to have some losers. That's going to mean real impacts on some sectors and a debate about who those winners and losers are going to be.
What's your view on this, Michael?
I think we must leave it's not actually called the single market, in EU documents. It's called the internal market.
Yes.
And the clue is in the name. So if we leave the European Union, we can't be part of the internal market or the single market. And I don't believe we should be members of the customs union either. And I don't actually think it's a question of negotiating 90% access or 80% access. I think it's basically a choice between two models. One, which would be in the interest of the European Union and of the UK, would be to have free trade in goods and full access for services on the basis of equivalence of regulation or mutual recognition, something like that. That would be the best. That's in their interest as well as ours. But if they're not interested in that, and if they want to somehow punish us, then we should say we're very happy with WTO rules.
The World Trade Organization.
Yeah, we can trade with you perfectly happily on that basis. And what's more, if that's what you want, we'll have 6 months or 12 months after we leave when we'll give you free access. And then you can decide. The onus is on you. Do you want to follow our lead and have free access, or do you want to put up your tariffs, in which case we will too?
During the campaign, you were credited with coming up with specific policies that could be implemented if we left the European Union. Things like an Australian-style point system on migration, more money for the NHS, famously on the bus, cutting VAT on energy bills. These were discussed, but it is clear from the May government that, of course, the Brexit campaign had no authority to promise these things.
Well, I think...
Because it hasn't happened.
Sure, it hasn't happened, but those people that were at the top of the Leave campaign then went into a leadership campaign, which they then lost. And so obviously Theresa May doesn't feel obligated to do what we had set out in the policy platform, and that's a shame. I think that actually the government will end up giving more money to the NHS because the NHS needs more money.
But then they have had to have done that anyway.
Sure, but the OBR has identified there's about £13 billion coming back from the EU, and I think that money should be spent on the NHS. And I think it's a good thing we highlighted that money should be spent on the NHS.
In your mind, are you reconciled now, just final question, are you reconciled now to us leaving the EU? Or do you still think that there may be ways, once the deal is done, for example, and perhaps a push for another referendum, that it could still be stopped?
That's not what we're arguing for at Open Britain, though I do think MPs should be given a say on the deal in the same way that they're being given a vote on the triggering of Article 50. David Davis, I think, said that it would be inconceivable that they wouldn't.
If the European Parliament also had it.
If the European Parliament, but Theresa May...
But in your mind, you think it's now it's on what terms we leave rather than trying to stop leaving.
Yes, I think we're leaving the European Union, but we should be able to have a full and frank debate about those terms without being shouted down and saying you're a democracy denier or you're trying to frustrate the will of the people because you're making the case for the single market or the customs union or an unprecedented deal on security or any of those things. We need to have a mature debate that moves beyond remain and leave.
No shouting down here, and we'll end our mature debate for now. Thank you both.
Thank you.
I'm very grown up of you all.